Now on to row 2 of the rubric with examples from the 3 sample videos I asked you to review. I need to take a moment and review with you the difference between rows 2 and 3 of the presentation oral defense rubric, because at first glance they might seem similar and therefore make it difficult for you to find evidence to score the work for these 2 rows. So, for row 2, this is really about the line of reasoning that the student presents. We want to know whether or not students are presenting a conclusion, which is comprised of an effective line of reasoning, or claims backed with evidence generated via their proposed method, and not simply a report of what is known via a literature review, or a review of the literature of the field. Students should be presenting the links between the evidence and claims that led to their overarching conclusion, or they can present the overarching conclusion and show how the claims and evidence flowed from that. It's okay if they show this line of reasoning forwards or backwards. Now, for row 3, this is about students reflecting back on the process and how it affected their initial assumptions or hypotheses. The students should present how their initial assumptions led them to choose their method or approach, and how the conclusions made through the interpreted evidence affected their initial assumptions or hypotheses. This is a true reflecting back on the inquiry process. So, in effect, row 2 is about the line of reasoning, or the connection between the evidence and claims and overarching conclusion, whereas row 3 is about reflecting back on the steps in the inquiry process affecting the initial assumptions or hypotheses. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at the verbs, qualifiers, and conjunctions for each column in row 2 of the rubric. For example, in the low column, the student must present an oversimplified or generalized conclusion. This is usually a report of the field or a simple conclusion without any connection between evidence generated via the chosen or developed method and the claims being made. So, in order to move into the medium column, the student must at the very least present the conclusion, but it is no longer oversimplified or generalized because it logically explains the connections between the evidence generated through the research method and the claims being made in the overall argument. Now, in order for the presentation to cross over into the high column, it must identify and explain the limited consequences, otherwise known as implications, for the conclusion. Okay, present and then explain connections, and then explain implications of the conclusion. But what about the qualifiers? This is a big one here. Let me explain. To move from low to medium, you need to move beyond an oversimplified conclusion, and what we mean here by oversimplified is a report on what is already known in the field. The reason we mean that is in order to move from low to medium, you need to show the connection between the evidence you generated via a research method, capital R research, and your conclusion. You can't do that if you only reported back what is already known in the field. After that, to move from medium to high, not only is the conclusion presented with the links between claims and evidence, and that is also explained, but there is an additional explanation of the limitations of the consequence or implications of the conclusion. This explanation cannot be as simple, well, there it is, or, more would be better. It needs to be a true explanation. Before I move on, I need to tell you about a pattern that could be seen in a fair few of the student samples. Students don't really seem to know what is a meta-analysis, and this misunderstanding is made bare in their academic paper, but it's made even more so in the presentation when they have to speak about the links between their claims and evidence. A meta-analysis is a statistical technique that allows the researcher to combine the results of several studies to determine whether or not they yield consistent, predictable results that can be generalized to a different population using a different treatment or in a different setting. This involves careful selection of the studies to be analyzed, careful selection of their data, and then careful selection of a statistical technique to be used on all that data to show similarities or differences between the studies in addressing the same problem, but maybe from different angles. So when a student says, I have performed a meta-analysis, you should see choices made about what studies, not informational pamphlets, to look at, what variables within those studies to quote-unquote study, and what statistical analyses to run on those variables to determine if a conclusion that emerges can be translated to multiple populations, multiple settings or contexts. Conversely, if you see a student saying, hey, I performed a meta-analysis, and it's a summary of reports that are already known in the field, this is not evidence generated from a true meta-analysis. This is an oversimplified conclusion made from a review of the literature of the field. Some students may say, hey, I'm doing a content analysis of all this literature in the field. And then they simply report back an oversimplified conclusion of what is already known in the field. This is not a content analysis. This is a literature review. A content analysis is a computerized technique that allows researchers to analyze text, to classify terms or phrases that are present in frequency in order to identify themes that are common between texts. This involves coding and interpretation of data. If you don't see evidence of a student telling you the content that they are choosing, how they are coding what they find in it, and how they are interpreting it into emerging themes, then they are not backing up claims with evidence generated via this research method. Instead, they are doing a literature review, and this will again generate an oversimplified generalized conclusion every time. So, to be clear, in many student samples, you may see students reviewing a lot of literature of what is already known in the field and calling this a meta or content analysis. Yet, they do not show the steps of either of these methods, nor do they present evidence generated from such in order to back their claims. Therefore, the claims being made will be generalized or oversimplified as they emerge simply from a review of the literature of the field and not a true research method. Alright, so now let's look at some examples for row 2 of the rubric. Row 2 is about establishing one's own argument, different than a report of what is already known in the field. So what we need to know is, does the student simply report on what is already known in the field, an oversimplified or overgeneralized conclusion, regardless of what they say their method is? Or can they present a logically organized argument that explains the connections between the evidence generated via their method and the claims made in their conclusion? In the Comfort Women video, the response earned 4 points for this row because evidence outlined at time 6:30 to 10:30 is extensive and connects well to the conclusion regarding the issue of educating high school students on comfort women. In other words, it presents the linked conclusions of Korean versus Japanese sentiments regarding the Japanese historical use of comfort women to the evidence generated via a method that involved quantitative and qualitative student survey responses, as well as presenting the linked textbook or content analysis to the research question about the extent to which comfort women was taught in high school. Compare that to the labor market video. The student could not always articulate how the argument was backed by evidence that should have been statistically analyzed and interpreted through a meta-analysis instead of a literature review. And you can see examples of this at time 12 minutes to 13:35. The conclusions and implications at time 17 for this sample are general or simple because the evidence generated came from a general review of the literature instead of a focused capital R research method. For this reason, the presentation cannot move past the low column. In addition to presenting a conclusion or logical argument that shows the connections between the method-generated evidence and claims, the next thing we're looking for is whether or not the presentation explains the limited effects of the conclusion. In other words, the implications. In scholarly research circles, this is often referred to as the so what of research. I guess you could think of it as, why should we care? In the alcohol abuse and commercial sample, the student linked her results to her conclusion using a simple graph to show the correlation between the number of alcohol-related commercials and the number of DUIs at time 10. The limitations and consequences of her conclusion are explained well between time 10:20 and 11:45. She talks about how other variables could account for the correlation, and she talks about how this research could affect Uber cost, insurance rates, etc. And hey, did you see her correct use of content analysis? She showed us the words, themes that she would look for in the alcohol content commercials, and she even showed us the prevailing theme that she found through her analysis. Well done. Compare that to the Comfort Women video, which shows the links between the evidence and claims being made, but falls short of reaching the high column, because the implication of the conclusion was not fully addressed beyond simply stating, we need to better educate high school students on the multiple perspectives of the issue of comfort women at time 11:23 to 13:33. Remember, the student must explain the implications, not simply state things could be better, or saying something like less is more or more is better. These are statements and not explanations. Therefore, this presentation cannot jump over the medium fence into the high column. So to recap, row 2 is about the line of reasoning, and we're looking for two things. Did the presentation report on what is already known in the field, Or did they have a logical argument backed by research method generated evidence with those connections made clear? Second, did the presentation give us an explanation of the limited consequences or implications of the conclusion that was developed, or did it simply state something like, well, things could be better if we just had more or less of XYZ? Well, first, I've yet to see a zero student sample because most students present a conclusion of some kind regardless of its quality. Low responses usually present an oversimplified or general conclusion coming from a review of what is known in the field. Be careful here. They may call their research method a meta or content analysis. It's up to you to know the difference between those methods and a simple review of what is already known in the field. Medium responses show a connection between method-generated evidence and claims being made in their conclusion, but that's about it. Sometimes they will state a limited consequence of the conclusion, like more would be better, but they don't explain it any further. High responses, of course, present the connections between the research method-generated evidence and the conclusion being made, but also state and explain the limited consequences or implications of the conclusion they made. Alright, now that we have completed row 2, grab something to drink, grab some snacks, and then let's power on to row 3 of the presentation or oral defense rubric.